This is American Government, Monday, October 26th, 2020. This is our third lecture on the presidency. In some ways, it's a continuation of the last lecture, um, in which we discussed the historical changes in the presidency since the founding. If you remember, um, we saw that the key word that describes the change in the presidency is growth. And on Friday, we examined the institutional growth of the presidency in terms of size and complexity, and also the scope and function of the executive branch as the scope and function of government grew, and in some ways as the complexity of regulating the economy and the expectations of managing the economy were placed onto the presidency. Um, as we saw in the Wilson chapter 2, the presidency has also grown in institutional power, centrality, and influence. And Wilson in chapter 10 even suggests that much of the growth of the modern presidency is because of informal expectations in democratic and popular politics, etc. And in fact, I think there are many reasons to explain why the presidency has become the central institution of the constitutional system. Media, as we saw, of all the institutions of government, the institution that has benefited most from the ability to communicate directly and visually, first, of course, in terms of radio and then television, and then the internet and social media, is the presidency. Um, but to some degree, much of this is also tied to the growth of the United States as a world power. Um, and especially in military and domestic and foreign affairs, the president is clearly the dominant actor, not the sole actor. When we turn on Wednesday to the current contemporary questions and criticisms of the presidency, and some people suggest, for instance, the book that I mentioned previously by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., published in 1974, The Imperial Presidency. Some people will suggest that the modern presidency is no longer bound by the Constitution, that in some ways the modern president, has become a kind of an emperor, um, unrestrained and untethered to the constitutional system. Regardless, we'll look at that criticism in our next lecture. But at least what I want to do today is to see how to describe the president's central role and dominant role in foreign affairs and military affairs. And then we'll end today with a consideration of the nature of modern presidential leadership, um, which, again, like many things, the intentions of the founders with respect to the presidency and other aspects of our constitutional system are controversial, and partially this depends upon one's own orientation as an historian or a political scientist or a scholar when one looks at these materials. What I tried to do on in our first lecture was to lay out the expectations for the presidency. And of course, it's not accidental that the most articulate expounder of the powers of the presidency was the most vigorous advocate of the energetic presidency, and that, of course, was Alexander Hamilton. So, in some ways, um, uh, especially when it comes to foreign affairs, we'll see that in some ways that Hamiltonian understanding of the power and centrality of the presidency has become the reality. And so one way of putting this question was, why is it that history showed that the great divide at the time of the founding between Madison and Hamilton about the nature of presidential powers and the scope of the presidency? Why Hamilton turned out to be the more predictive one was, in some ways, one possibility is, and I think this is my understanding, but it's my understanding, although hardly idiosyncratic, that Hamilton grasped the nature of the constitutional system and the presidency within it, perhaps more foresightedly than anyone else. Um, but and when we come to a consideration of how the presidency has grown in modern times, especially, as I said, in the realm of foreign affairs and military affairs, again, there are still also controversies about certain exercises of presidential power. And I have a caution to say that in some ways you have to be careful when people make institutional critiques of, say, contemporary presidents, certain controversial contemporary presidents, because oftentimes the critique that a critic makes of the office is more a political critique of the actions of the occupant of the office. And this is a common theme that often stretches through institutional reform or proposals for institutional reform. One of the tasks, I think, of a thoughtful individual, historically and politically, is to separate the contemporary and the journalistic dimension of politics, the everyday and partisan and contemporary issues in politics, from the long range nature of the office. So, um, at any rate, uh, I think the best example of the Hamiltonian understanding of the presidency, uh, uh, at least in judicial affirmation by the Supreme Court, and in some ways, as I suggest in my notes, that this understanding both expressed, confirmed, and in some ways enabled the Hamiltonian growth of the modern presidency is U.S. v. Curtis Wright in 1936, number 45 in the Nichols Reader. What I want to do is give you a little bit of background to this case, and then we'll walk through the issues that gave rise to the case. And when I teach constitutional law, I always love to do that. I love to consider the facts and the questions, the practical conflicts in the case, because they often really help to understand the constitutional questions involved. And then in the second part of today's lecture, we'll turn to a pretty good piece of writing by either John F. Kennedy himself, or more likely his speechwriters, as most politicians and occupants in high office in America no longer write their own speeches. We've come a very long way from the time when supposedly Abraham Lincoln, on the train ride up to Gettysburg, jotted out his 12-minute Gettysburg Address, which stands as one of the great examples of presidential and political rhetoric in the United States. So nobody writes his or her own speeches in politics today, whether the president, vice president. I was a speechwriter myself, actually, in the 1980s, and wrote for Caspar Weinberger and Dick Cheney, who were the Secretary of Defense at that time. So members of Congress, senators, in some ways judges of the Supreme Court. Everybody has speechwriters that draft their original works, and many people running for president who have campaign books. Those campaign books, generally speaking, are almost always draft written or ghost written by somebody else, even if the final supervision of the product, the speech or the book or the whatever, is looked over by the individual. They almost never individually produce it. So regardless of whether this is President Kennedy, or I should say candidate John F. Kennedy's own speech or own writing during the presidential campaign of 1960 against Richard Nixon, or one of his speechwriters, it's a great expression of the modern understanding of leadership in the presidency, as we'll see. So let's look at U.S. v. Curtis Wright and take it apart. The most important background in terms of understanding the case and Justice Sutherland's opinion in it is the constitutional doctrine of the non-delegability of legislative power. Now, part of this comes from the Wilson text, but part of it also comes from our intensive review of the Constitution several weeks ago, and especially the question of the meaning and importance of the vesting clauses. You know that the first section of Articles 1, 2, and 3 are called the vesting clauses because they grant the power of that branch of government. And as we discussed it then, the vesting clauses are an embodiment of the general theory of the separation of powers. And the idea, of course, is that in these three branches of government, these three core functions of government, to draft laws, to enforce laws, and to interpret laws, as you might have learned them from your 8th grade civics class or high school civics class. Nevertheless, it's an important doctrine that the powers of government, the core structure of the Constitution, tries to divide the power of government and the functions of government. These are three broad categories, and then assigns them to these three branches. And the reason that they're called vesting clauses, if you remember, is because the assignment of that core function to that branch is almost like a right of property. And so not only does it mean that the other branches can't take that function away from you, that would be overstepping their function, unless, by the way, the Constitution is explicit for the purposes of checks and balances of assigning certain aspects of the one branch's power to another. So, for instance, just to make sure you understand what I mean by this, the president signs all legislation and can reject legislation, and we call that the veto power. But if you think about it, then that means that gives the head of the executive branch some power over what actually constitutes laws. Doesn't the veto, or I should say the requirement of the president signing, unless it's overridden by both houses of Congress with a two-thirds vote, um, doesn't that grant some legislative authority to the president? Yes, it does. And in the same way, the Senate consenting to presidential nominations within the executive branch grants, at least to the Senate, some dimensions of executive power. These are parts of, and as we saw how this worked in Federalist 51, these are part of the constitutional system of checks and balances, where some of a branch's power is given to another branch so that the other branch can defend itself and check the operation of that power. Nevertheless, of course, those grants of power for purposes of checks and balances have to be explicit in the Constitution. And so the general theory of separation of powers is that unless the Constitution, for the purposes of checks and balances, specifically and explicitly grants some power of one branch to another, all that power that is vested in that branch belongs to that branch. Now, especially when it comes to the legislative authority granted to Congress, this is where the doctrine, not only can another branch not take a branch's duly vested power, but that branch can't give it away either. And this is where the doctrine of the non-delegability of legislative authority comes in. It's Congress's function to pass laws, and the doctrine of the non-delegability of legislative authority holds that when Congress passes laws, the law has to contain principles. It has to contain content. The, the, in other words, it can't just have the form of a law where Congress would say to the president, here's a problem, do whatever that you want and we'll support it. The idea is that Congress cannot pass laws that are blank checks of unlimited discretion to the executive branch or the judicial branch for that matter. And that therefore every law has to contain some principle which defines what the law's purpose, operation, and scope is. And so, as a little more background, remember this case was in 1936. In 1929, the stock market crashed and the Great Depression began. And President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected to the presidency in 1932 and subsequently in 3 other elections. And by the way, the Democratic Party at that point, this to go back to the question of the two-party system and party realignment when the parties shift, up until 1932, from the end of the Civil War, even with the exception of critical Democratic presidents like Woodrow Wilson in World War I and previous to World War I, Wilson was a 2-term Democratic president. The Republican Party from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of the Depression was really the majority party in the United States. But then the crisis of the Depression and the economic dislocation in American life caused Americans to rethink that. And after 1932, because Franklin Roosevelt beat Herbert Hoover massively in the presidential election, it was a landslide. But then also that both houses of Congress and many governorships and many state legislatures also became Democratic. So from 1932 on, almost to the time of Ronald Reagan and perhaps to the time of George Bush, for instance, with a couple of exceptions in the 1950s, the Democrats held both houses of Congress up until 1994. Now, having said that, the presidency was more mixed. After all, FDR, who was a Democratic president and was elected 4 terms, was followed by Harry Truman, who was a Democrat, and then Eisenhower was a 2-term Republican. Kennedy was a 1-term Democrat, of course, because he perished in the assassination in 1963. and then his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who had been a senator from Texas and the majority leader in the Senate during the 1950s, and very powerful, became Kennedy's vice president, and then, of course, was massively reelected in the election of '64. But then Richard Nixon, who was defeated in 1960, by the way, in his contest with John Kennedy, was in fact elected in 1968 narrowly over LBJ's, Lyndon Baines Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey. And then basically, to take you up to today, it's been a mixture with the balance sort of turning towards Republican presidents, because Nixon won re-election in '72, but then was forced to resign in 1974 because of the Watergate scandal. And his vice president, the first vice president chosen under the 25th Amendment, Gerald Ford, was a one-term president. Jimmy Carter in 1976 defeated him, who was a Democrat. But then Ronald Reagan in 1980 defeated Jimmy Carter, who did not win re-election. Reagan served 2 terms, and then his vice president, George Bush I, was elected in 1988, but then was defeated by Bill Clinton, the Democrat, in 1992. Clinton was reelected in 1996 over his Republican challenger, and then, of course, George Bush narrowly defeated Al Gore in 2000, and then served in 2 terms. And then John McCain ran against Barack Obama and was defeated in 2008. And of course, President Obama served 2 terms and then was succeeded by Donald Trump. So the balance of Republican and Democrat in the presidency has gone pretty much even, with some accent on the Republicans. But the majority party in America from the New Deal to about the 1980s was the Democratic Party. And President Roosevelt, FDR, passed in concert with the massively Democratic Congress very expansive economic legislation in the early stages of what came to be called the New Deal. And very swiftly, the Supreme Court invalidated much, if not almost all, of the New Deal legislation up until 1937, when there was a change of orientation on the court, primarily because FDR got more of his appointees on. And that was a part of, by the way, the 1937 court packing plan, which is where that term entered our discourse, where President Roosevelt was so frustrated by the Supreme Court regularly declaring massive parts of the New Deal legislation unconstitutional that he wanted to create a new court that would support the New Deal legislation. That was extremely unpopular. And even though he was sort of master of the political landscape and had large majorities in Congress in both houses, nevertheless, he was roundly criticized for trying to change the nature of the judicial branch, or the orientation, through political manipulation. And that was what was called court packing, where you expand the members of the court. As we're going to see when we turn to the judiciary, the Constitution does not set the number of Supreme Court justices. And indeed, over time, it's gone from 5 to 7 to 9 to 11 during the Civil War. But then since the end of the Civil War, it's remained by custom and by tradition at 9. And that's, as we'll see, that issue itself has become controversial in contemporary politics. But at any rate, that's all background for the doctrine of the non-delegability of legislative authority. Because among other reasons, one of the reasons that so much New Deal legislation had been declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, including, by the way, Justice Sutherland, who wrote the opinion in this case, as you'll see, rather surprisingly, was because much of the domestic legislation that Congress passed to empower the president to deal with the economic emergency of the Depression was held by the court to violate this doctrine. So this was an important constitutional, it still is, by the way, and this is still a valid constitutional doctrine. Congress still is limited in its ability to craft laws by this doctrine. When it passes a law, it must actually contain a principle which guides or restrains executive discretion in interpreting and applying the law, except, as you'll see, in some ways, with respect to foreign affairs. So in this case, by the way, and the Nichols reader is articulates this. Let's talk about the facts of the case and how the conflict came between the United States and Curtis Wright Export Corporation. Curtis Wright, by the way, is still a company. It exists on 95 as you drive into Charlotte. There's Curtis Wright on the right. And it was a manufacturing company, and one of the things it manufactured was arms. And so by the 1936, Bolivia had descended into a civil war, and and um, uh, and and as you're going to see, it was the disposition of the Congress and the president uh, that that the United States should not become involved in that civil war. Now, how did the policy come about? Congress passed, first of all, the joint resolution. I'm going to read this from page 253 of the Nichols Reader. Um, Resolved, I'm going to have to put my other set of eyes on. Excuse me. There we go. What a good-looking guy. Resolved by the House and Senate of Representatives of the United States of America and Congress assembled. Here, we won't have my face bobbing around as if I was a dashboard bobble puppet. That if the President finds that the prohibition of the sale of arms and munitions of war in the United States to those countries now engaged in armed conflict in the Chaco, the region of Bolivia where the war was taking place, may contribute to the reestablishment of peace between those countries, and if he makes a proclamation to that effect, it shall be unlawful to sell, export, except under the terms the President declares. So the joint resolution passed by Congress says that it shall be unlawful to sell arms to any of the parties involved in the conflict if the President declares it in U.S. policy to prevent it. And then subsequently, the President indeed offered a proclamation, as it says on the bottom of page 253. Now, therefore, I, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States of America, acting under and by virtue of the authority conferred in me by said joint resolution, do hereby declare and proclaim that I have followed the prohibition. So he issues a proclamation, so forth, you can do the rest of it, that indeed prohibited the sale of arms. U.S. Curtis Wright then actually sold arms in violation of the proclamation, violation of the joint resolution and the proclamation, and was fined and charged with violating the proclamation. So the company argued that the president's proclamation was unconstitutional because the joint resolution that authorized the president to issue that proclamation was an unconstitutional delegation of legislative authority. How did they make that argument? If you look in the 17 specific, 18 if you include the necessary and proper clause, if you remember our consideration of this from McCulloch v. Maryland, 18 specific powers are given to the Congress, among which one of them is the power to declare war. So what Curtis Wright was arguing was Congress passed a law which didn't declare war, it let the president make that distinction, or that decision, and therefore delegated to the president the congressional power to declare war. So as you'll see, that's the claim that Curtis Wright had made, and then the legal or constitutional argument that they made. And Sutherland responds, essentially, as you'll see, by making, first of all, the critical distinction between domestic policy and foreign policy. He even says, by the way, if this had been an issue of domestic policy, that would be one question, although he says we're not going to deal with that. But the court clearly did use this doctrine in domestic policy, as I mentioned earlier, to declare many laws of Congress unconstitutional, and actions of the president on the grounds that indeed the Congress did violate this doctrine by giving too much or unguided authority to the president. But the first critical distinction Sutherland makes is between domestic and foreign affairs. And his argument is it roughly is this, and we'll quote from significant portions of it, is that constitutionally there's a core distinction between domestic affairs and foreign affairs and war. That foreign affairs and war are an attribute of sovereignty, which the Union, even in its initial embodiment in the Articles of Confederation, possessed as a nation. That the Constitution didn't create the power to declare war or the power to engage in foreign affairs. That's inherent in national sovereignty. And in some ways, as he explains, well, but doesn't it say Congress has the power to declare war? Yes. In a sense, you'll see, he makes this broad distinction, um, uh, and and argues that the purpose of the enumeration of powers in Article 1, Section 8 isn't so much to divide the power, especially in foreign affairs, among the three branches of government. Its main purpose, and there is some truth to this, the reason that Article 1, Section 8 is there is not only to specify and enumerate Congress's powers, it's because of the nature of federalism in our system. That is to say, what the Constitution does in Article 1, Section 8 is distinguish between national power and state power. And the powers given to the national government under Article 1, Section 8 are primarily there to prevent the states from exercising them. And that's not unhistorical or illogical. But in some ways, Sutherland takes the idea that, therefore, Article 1, Section 8 is not the source of the national government's powers to engage in foreign affairs. It would have had that anyway. And as you'll see, that has particular relevance for the presidency and the executive branch. This is from Sutherland's opinion. It results, quote, that the investment of the federal government with the powers of external sovereignty did not depend upon the affirmative grants of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. The powers to declare war and wage war, to conclude peace, to make treaties, to maintain diplomatic relations with other sovereignties, if they had never been mentioned in the Constitution, would have vested in the federal government as necessary concomitants, would have been vested in the federal government as necessary concomitants of nationality. Neither the Constitution nor the laws passed in pursuance of it have any force in foreign territory unless in respect of our own citizens. As a member of the family of nations, the right and power of the United States in that field are equal to the right and power of the other members of the international family. Otherwise, the United States is not completely sovereign. So his core point here is when it comes to domestic affairs, the enumeration of powers is relevant because it tells what the national government can do as opposed to the states. But when it comes to foreign affairs, the Constitution isn't the source of the ability to declare war and peace and act in foreign affairs. That's an inherent part of sovereignty. Moreover, following Hamilton, um, after deciding that constitutionally foreign affairs are quite different from domestic affairs, uh, uh, following Hamilton, Sutherland goes on to argue, quote, in the middle of the second page of the notes, the president is the constitutional representative of the United States with regard to foreign nations. He manages our concerns with foreign nations and must necessarily be most competent to determine when, how, and upon what subject negotiations may be urged with the greatest prospect of success. For his conduct, he is responsible to the Constitution. And so, in some ways, setting up this argument, foreign affairs are inherent in the sovereignty of the Union. The president is the primary bearer of the function of guiding the nation and in foreign affairs and war. And this is his conclusion. It is important to bear in mind that we are dealing not alone with the authority vested in the president by an exertion of legislative authority, but with such an authority plus the very delicate plenary. And if you haven't looked up the word or don't know what the word plenary means, it's a fancy political term for full. Delicate, full, and exclusive power of the president as the sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations. That phrase, the sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations, is almost a direct quote from an essay, a series of essays that Hamilton wrote in 1793 when he defended George Washington's suspension of the Treaty of Mutual Assistance with France, which was quite unpopular at the time. In fact, the single most unpopular act that Washington had concluded. And the reason he did that was this, by the way, here's the background of that. The Treaty of Mutual Assistance with France goes back to the Revolutionary War. And if you remember, Article 6 of the Constitution says any treaties that were concluded, and pacts and obligations and debts, this is the beginning of Article 6, if you remember, that were concluded under the Articles are valid under the Constitution. So even though this was a treaty between France and the United States during the Revolutionary War and under the Articles of Confederation, by the Constitution says it's still valid. Washington single-handedly suspended that treaty and declared the United States neutral in the ongoing war between France and Britain. Now, we won't go into the reasons why Washington did that, but what Hamilton defended was the president's authority to suspend a treaty unilaterally. Now, you know from your reading of the Constitution that treaties are made by the president by and with the advice of 2/3 of the Senate. And therefore, the common understanding before Hamilton's essay was that in order to suspend a treaty or end a treaty, you had to go through the same process that you would have to do to overturn a law or to repeal a law. The Congress would have to do that, or this. So in this case, the argument was the president couldn't unilaterally suspend a treaty; it had to ask the Senate's permission. Washington did not agree, and Hamilton supported this, and therefore gave this very broad interpretation of the president's authority in foreign affairs, which Sutherland is in effect embodying in this decision. So to continue, a power which does not require as a basis for its exercise an act of Congress, but which, of course, like every other governmental power, must be exercised in subordination to the applicable provisions of the Constitution. So, in a sense, what Sutherland is saying is this. The president already had the authority to issue this proclamation, and that the congressional resolution was not an unconstitutional grant or delegation of legislative power to the president because he already had it. Well, what was the resolution in some ways? Sullivan's understanding is, since the president could have done this with or without the resolution, it was primarily a resolution of political support, and that the resolution didn't actually grant the president. The president had it, as I said already. The president already had this authority and was already exercising this. So the idea that the president is the sole representative or actor of the national government in foreign affairs, as expressed by this, and as was Hamilton's opinion, more or less is the governing understanding of the president's authority in modern politics and international relations. Now, I also teach constitutional law, as I mentioned earlier, and there are many other Supreme Court cases that do, in fact, limit the president's power in specific ways. I won't discuss it here, but I'll mention it. A critical case was in 1952, Youngstown Sheet and Tube v. Sawyer, where President Truman, during the Korean War, there was a steel strike, and Truman, using his authority as commander-in-chief, ordered the Secretary of Commerce, Sawyer, to seize, not expropriate, which is different, but to seize the steel mills and keep them in operation while the Korean War was going on the grounds that the steel strike would affect the nation's ability to produce weapons, which would affect the nation's ability to engage in the Korean War. And the Supreme Court struck down that seizure and argued that the president had overstepped that grounds. So there have been many important court cases, as I mentioned in the notes, that limit presidential discretion in foreign and military affairs. Probably the most important congressional act, although it has more or less fallen by the wayside because parts of it were declared unconstitutional. But also, most presidents, Democratic and Republican, have ignored it, and that was the War Powers Act of 1973, which was premised on the notion that the Vietnam War was a presidential war, first by Johnson and then by Nixon, conducted without congressional support or authority. Now that's very controversial. And the War Powers Act, which technically is still in force, but most presidents have simply ignored it. All of them have, by the way, both Republican and Democrat. And the Supreme Court, as I said, declared certain portions of it unconstitutional. The War Powers Act of 1973 tried to pull back some of the authority which was understood to have been slipped into the president's hands. So there are, and as we'll see when we come back to the great question of whether the contemporary president is in fact an imperial presidency, is in fact unmoored or disconnected from constitutional limits and foundations. That's the question one of the questions we'll turn to in our next lecture. Um, Nevertheless, Sutherland's opinion in U.S. v. Curtis Wright is expressive of, and I think does represent the modern consensus of both parties, in essence, in foreign affairs. So the other main topic I want to cover today is in Kennedy's campaign speech is the way that the president now serves as the central source of leadership and what kinds of leadership the modern presidency is expected to perform. And I think again, it is a great take on the way the president operates in our system, regardless of whether it was Kennedy or somebody else who wrote it. It's a great statement of what we expect from the modern president in terms of leadership. Now, I want to tie that to our discussion in our first lecture on the presidency when we looked at Federalist 70 through 74 by Hamilton. And if you remember, Hamilton in that essay, in those essays, starts out by defending the energetic executive and that the energy in the executive is a leading quality in good government. And if you remember, then why does the executive branch, why does the presidency need energy, which I defined, if you remember, as the capacity for swift and decisive action. Remember, Hamilton assigns four tasks to the executive branch: defense, military affairs, enforcement of the laws, stability, the stability that underlies the core nature of a law-abiding society, and then he says, and coherence against the assaults of ambition and faction. And if you remember, I suggested that fourth function is probably what we would today call leadership. That in a Republican form of government, this is a kind of a Federalist 10 argument, if you remember, with all these factions, freedom, that at least in the legislature, the country's always being tugged in different directions, depending on which faction has power and many different and multiple factions that, of course, the large extended republic encourages. So the framers did understand that somehow in this giant, diverse republic of different factions, there had to be someone at the helm. There had to be someone at the rudder, and that's what Hamilton seems to be suggesting. That the president, a strong, vigorous president, actually adds an important element to Republican or popular government by providing a focus of leadership. And in Kennedy's campaign speech, he articulates the four senses in which we understand the president to be the source of leadership. Those four are what he calls the executive or administrative leadership, legislative leadership, party leadership, and national or moral leadership. Let's examine these and see that I think he's right, and we do expect the president to be a leader in all these respects. And that in some ways, it's interesting is some of these aspects of leadership are in tension with each other. And it's fine. I mean, look, life is full of tensions and contradictions, and even the constitutional system, you could say, which has governed the nation for almost 250 years and presided more stability and freedom to the American people than any other existent system of government. Nevertheless, there are tensions within that system, and as you'll see in Kennedy's discussion, some of the aspects of leadership don't easily jive with each other. That doesn't mean we don't expect them of the modern president. And in some ways, you could say this, that the success of any particular presidency may depend upon the occupant's ability to hold these four kinds of leadership in proper relationship. So the most obvious one is the executive leadership. That is, the president is the constitutional head of the executive branch and therefore is the administrative leader. And of course, because in Article 2, Section 1, the vesting clause, it says the president shall have the executive power to execute the laws. He takes an oath to execute the office of the president, and to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, the supreme law of the land. In Article 2, Section 3, the president, this is both a power and a duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So the president has broad control over the vast and sprawling executive branch. And even though, as we'll see when we turn to the bureaucracy, significant portions of the executive branch aren't responsible to direct command of the president, for reasons we'll see, nevertheless, the president is the boss of the executive branch. I gave an example. Let me repeat that example. That when Ronald Reagan was president in the 1980s, the air traffic controllers, about 20,000 of them, uh, uh, all over the airports, which are regulated by the Federal Aviation Authority, struck. They went on strike. And why can't they go on strike? Because in their legal contracts, they take a vow not to strike. And there's both a legal or constitutional dimension to this and a practical one. It so happens that by the 1980s, almost all the air traffic control radar had now been computerized. And so one of the reasons that, so what Reagan did, by the way, in response to the strike was to fire all those thousands of air traffic controllers that had gone on strike on the grounds that they had violated the conditions of their contract. So that was his legal authority to do that, and the practical ability to do it was generated by the newly computerized radar systems. But at any rate, that shows that the president does exercise in many ways the direct control over the executive branch. He's responsible for making sure that the laws that the executive branch executes are responsibly executed. Second one, less obvious from constitutional language, is that we expect the president now to be the leader of Congress now, but this is a separate branch of government. It's not a president, and as we saw from our prior discussion, the president's not a prime minister. He's not a member of Congress. So why is it that the president, he or she, is understood to be the primary leader? Because we now expect the president, and I think this goes back to Abraham Lincoln, perhaps to Woodrow Wilson, to Teddy Roosevelt, certainly to Franklin Roosevelt, but all modern presidents are expected to approach the nation with a legislative program. And both candidates in the presidential race in 2020 have defended their candidacy on the grounds of what kinds of laws and what kind of legislative program that they would try to persuade Congress to pass. Now, the accent is on try to persuade, but of course, because the president is a separate branch, the president can propose and suggest what kind of legislation and perhaps lead Congress. But remember, that is in some ways an informal expectation. We do expect the president to do that. And if our president didn't stand up and offer a legislative program for Congress, we would consider that president deficient. The third kind of leadership, of course, is it's extra constitutional because the party system, as you know, as we saw, grew up after the constitutional system. But you'd have to say that by the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, and certainly by Andrew Jackson in 1828 and 1830, the idea that the president was also the leader of his or her party had become a normal expectation. And so, even though there is a formal national committee, the Democratic National Committee, the Republican National Committee, and even though both parties have a formally elected chair, nevertheless, we understand the president to be the primary leader of his or her party. And to some degree, we expect the president to use his leadership of his or her party to effect the other two kinds of leadership over the parts of the executive branch that the president appoints, and to cooperate with the party members, his or her party members in Congress. Now, Wilson does a good job of showing that sometimes the president's a better legislative leader when he reaches across party lines, and that some of the periods of divided government have been just as fruitful in terms of creating a successful presidency as when a political party held both houses of Congress and the presidency. So, nevertheless, that's an expectation of the presidency that clearly wasn't embedded in the original constitutional system for reasons, of course, that the original Constitution did not possess political parties. Now, the last kind of leadership is also, I think, genuine. In 1986, I remember in January when the Challenger, the space shuttle, exploded, and Krista McAuliffe was the first citizen, a teacher, who was to ride on the space shuttle into space, and then, of course, tragically, in launch, that exploded. It was shocking, and the nation was taken aback. And President Reagan, even though he was a vigorous Republican and was right in the midst of partisan politics, stepped forward and offered a remarkable moment of consolation to the entire nation. And and this is that last and highest notion of leadership, that the president is the national or moral leader of the entire nation in times of crisis and distress, and that in some ways this last role or expectation of leadership of the presidency transcends partisanship. Now, we live in a very partisan times when it's hard to imagine uh, um, um, either people who really love and support President Trump or people who despise and hate President Trump. Hard to imagine uh, a president being able to step outside the bonds of partisanship. Yet, both candidates have argued that this is what their aspiration is. Um, President candidate Biden said, "There, I'm a Democrat, but if I'm elected, I won't recognize red states, blue states. I'll be the president of all the states." We understand that somehow the president is the embodiment of the nation, and that under those times when the nation's resolve is tested, or through crisis or war or emergency, that somehow the president rises above the partisan divisions that are the normal bellwether or marker of our politics. It's very difficult to do, and especially, I would say, between the president as party leader and the president as transpartisan national leader, there's a real tension. But the greatest presidents have managed to articulate that tension. And even though Lincoln was a Republican, and even though Wilson was a Democrat, and even though FDR was a Democrat, and Truman was a Democrat, and Eisenhower was a Republican, and so forth, in our greatest moments as a nation, the presidency has arisen, I think, has risen up and fulfilled this last expectation of national, transpartisan, and moral leadership. Difficult to do, but that's why the presidency is a difficult office.